Great. Well, does anybody know the famous catchphrase of this person on the screen? Yes, that's right. This is Catherine Tate's character, Lauren, and her famous catchphrase is, "Am I bothered?" She is not bothered about anything. She doesn't care about what people think of her, and she's just out to cause trouble. And as we will see, this is the complete opposite of Nehemiah. And as an aside, Nehemiah is probably my favorite book in the Bible and one of my favorite characters. And it's not just because the story is really exciting and amazing, but it's because a time in my life when I was feeling spiritually low and far from God, after the death of a very good friend of mine in a mountaineering accident, God used this book to draw me back to him. In Nehemiah, I saw a God who walks alongside us and is there for us in times of trouble and when times are good. But I wonder, what are you bothered about? What is your biggest complaint? Now, I'm not talking about whether your bins got collected or not this week. And I'm not talking about whether you had to queue for an hour to get petrol, although that is obviously very stressful. I'm talking about the things that grieve the heart of God and the things that we share in that grief with him. When you look at the area and the town and the world that we live in, what are the injustices? What are the things that you would try and fix first? For Nehemiah, it was Jerusalem. And it wasn't just because it was a great capital city. It was because this was the center of everything that happened with God. This was the symbol that God was with them, the center of their spiritual life and their mission to the rest of the world. You see, in Isaiah 60, Israel had been called a light to the nation. Their purpose was outside of themselves. And Nehemiah's big complaint was that Jerusalem was in ruins. The center of everything, faith-wise, was in ruins and needed to be rebuilt. So what is your holy complaint? And the list of where God is needed and where there is injustices could go on for ages and ages and could get a little bit depressing. But do you grieve for people who don't know Jesus personally? Do you grieve for the disproportionate effect of COVID on young people? Do you grieve for the loneliness in our community? For people who caught in addictions? And there's no doubt that the church needs to be rebuilt after COVID. But the church is rebuilt because it has a purpose outside of itself. The church's purpose is outside of those doors. Now, we heard from Simon last week that Nehemiah was a cupbearer for the king. And actually, this isn't a lowly position. This is a well-respected position. And a position where he had the ear of the king. And Nehemiah actually had a lot going for him. He had a great job. And as long as he didn't do anything silly, like, say, look sad in front of the king, he had reasonable job security. He would have had a brilliant education in Persia, gone to the best Persian universities, and he would have had accommodation in the palace, or at least the palace grounds. So where he lived was a low-crime area for sure. And one of the other interesting details about Nehemiah was that he was probably a very good-looking person. The Persian kings had surrounded themselves with great opulence and the most beautiful things, and that included people as well. So if we looked at Nehemiah now, we would say, he's very comfortable. He has a lot going before him. He has good things going on in his lives. Nehemiah was willing to give that up for God's purposes. He was willing to give it up for the complaint that he was sharing with God. Now, about 30 years ago, my parents built the house that they still live in. Although, actually, they've recently put it up for sale. So if anybody is thinking of moving to the West Country, there's a lovely house there. But it was hard work. It took a lot of effort. They actually did it before Grand Designs made self-building quite popular. But they had the classic, there was unforeseen things that went over budget. There was really stressful things went on. But if my parents had just talked about building a house, nothing would have happened. If my parents had just stared blankly at the plans, nothing would have happened. They had to take action and they had to break ground. They had to act and move. And Nehemiah, although prayed, he then started to do something. Between chapter 1 and chapter 2 that was read today was about 4 months. So Nehemiah spent around 4 months praying and fasting. But then it was time to act. And we don't know whether Nehemiah planned and deliberately tried to look sad in front of the king, or whether he just couldn't contain it and he looked sad, just looked sad in front of the king. But he took a great risk in doing that. The Persian kings ruled with an iron fist. What they said was law. There was no due process. If the king didn't like the look of you, then it could be your life or at least going to prison. But Nehemiah was really compelled by the holy complaint that he had. And he was compelled by this connection that he had with God as well. The connection that he'd been praying through for the last 4 months. And he does manage to catch the king on a good day. And the king sympathetically asks what is wrong. And verse 4 shows that he's still a little bit nervous, even though the king is being kind towards him. And verse 4 also shows that he is still praying while things are going on, and he maintains that connection with God. But Nehemiah has his request granted. You see, God's favor is on Nehemiah. God backs up what he says he will do. And Nehemiah not only gets letters of authorization, he gets materials to build, and he gets the added bonus that he didn't even ask for of armed protection. And as we'll see, that was actually needed as well. Verse 9 shows us that God was with him. God was going before him. God was surrounding him. Now, St. Andrew's has an audacious vision to be a resource church, to bless Wickham and beyond. And we can be sure that he is as good as his word. He is going to back up what he says he will do. We have, in this church, we all have holy complaints. We have complaints that we want to see put right in the world. We share grievances with God. And here this morning, we are sharing a connection with God, and we all connect with God. And we can be sure that God will build his church and his kingdom through us and this community here. Now, Nehemiah had a complaint and he had a connection with God. But Nehemiah was also all in. He uses his commitment to move forward. Now, with this slide, I felt quite happy because I think I've reached the pinnacle of public speaking. There's a Venn diagram and alliteration, so I was very happy with this slide. But Nehemiah, with his connection and his complaint, uses his commitment. Nehemiah moves forward. He's ready to do something. But he doesn't just go into things blindly. He doesn't just go forward and do anything and just blunder forward. He takes time to figure out what is needed. You know, when he gets to Jerusalem, he takes 3 days. I think in that time, although we don't know for sure, that he was still praying through things. And he goes to inspect the walls. He doesn't just start rebuilding blindly. He starts to inspect the walls. And it looks like things are probably a little bit harder than he first thought, because when he's going round the walls, he has to get off whatever he's riding, a horse or a donkey. But he is prepared to pick up that trowel to rebuild. He wants to use his commitment that he has. Now, in our house, we really love Lego. My boys have lots of fire service sets, they have police sets, and they're getting into the Marvel superhero sets. And it's just great to build those sets with them. For me, it's regressing, because when I was young, I used to love to build Lego sets. And I built whole towns. And apparently I used to get really frustrated when my brother, who was younger than me, would come through and break them. And also, when he was outside of the playpen, apparently I would get in the playpen with my Lego so that he couldn't destroy them. And now that I have children, there is nothing better than Christmas Day afternoon building those Lego sets as well. And with Lego, there is endless possibilities. You could build anything you want. But if you want whatever the picture is on the box, if you want that fire station, you're going to need to follow the instructions. If you want the vision of what you see on the box, you need to follow the instructions. You need to work out what is coming next and put the right thing in the right place. You can't just put any old brick on any other brick and hope that what's on the picture just comes up. And Nehemiah does this. He is committed, but he plans ahead for what is next. We see these aspects of Nehemiah's life reflected in the life of Jesus as well. His big complaint is that people are far from God and there are people suffering. And he comes to do something about that. He comes to draw us back to God. His connection with God is just undeniable. Jesus could say, "You only see me doing what the Father is doing." And he could say that because of all the early mornings that he got up to pray, and that all the time he was sensing what the Spirit of God is doing. And Jesus' commitment is obvious. It took him all the way to the cross for us. But it didn't just stop at the cross and resurrection. In Revelation 21, verse 5, Jesus says, "I am making all things new." And that chapter paints a picture of a time of no suffering and no pain. And it's on that journey of Jesus making everything new that he calls us to join in with him. Nehemiah went to rebuild the ancient Jerusalem. And Jesus calls us to work towards a new Jerusalem. He calls us to use our complaints and our connection to him and our commitment for the purposes that are outside of ourselves. So what do we do with this? Well, we mustn't lose our connection with God. Now, I've had a real battle with technology this morning, which is another story. But I do really love technology. I'm one of these people that you might count as an early adopter. If it's new and shiny, I want to buy it. But I love technology when it works. When iPhones first came out, if you wanted to sync your iPhone to your iTunes, you had to plug it into your laptop. But now, everything is on the cloud, and that is amazing. That is wonderful when it works. Recently, I had a problem with my note-taking app, and I wanted to sync across all my devices. Obviously, this is a very first world problem, but I wanted to sync it across all my devices. And it wouldn't do it. It would only show up on the device that I wrote the note on. And I spent a lot of frustration and probably a little bit too much time troubleshooting this problem. And it turned out there was an error that I needed to get over that was causing a loss of connection between these devices. And I don't know about you, I felt certainly a loss of connection to community over COVID, but I think that also affected my connection with God. It was hard worshiping at home, not meeting with other people, not being encouraged, not having the same patterns in life. We need to prioritize our connection as we plan to rebuild. It's really, really easy to get out of a habit and out of a discipline. But it's really, really hard to get back into that habit and that discipline. Anybody who does any sort of sport or exercise will tell you that is true. But it's from that connection that we work out what we are bothered about. It's when we don't have that connection that, I don't know about you, but during lockdown, you start to think, am I bothered? And that leads us to a complaint. What is your complaint? Some of you have already got hold of a holy complaint from God and going for it, and some of you may be sat there thinking, literally no idea whatsoever. Well, in the 1980s, the Anglican Church came up with the 5 marks of mission, and some other denominations use these too. There's tell, teach, tend, transform, and treasure. We tell people by sharing faith, teach people by baptize new Christians, tend is about meeting human needs, transform is about transforming unjust structures, and treasure is around creation care. Is your heart broken for those who don't know Jesus? Do you want to help build up those in the church for when they are sent out? Do you grieve for those on the margins? Do you see ways to fix the world? Do you feel pain for the way our planet is at the moment? Now, some of you may know we moved here from Bristol, and there's a famous Christian from Bristol from the 19th century called George Muller. Some of you may have heard of him. And he had a holy complaint for the orphans in Bristol. And it led him to set up huge orphanages, and some of those buildings are still there in Bristol now. Some of them are overpriced flats, which is ironic. But he used his connection to God and his complaint and his commitment to literally house and save and feed tens of thousands of children. God used him in an amazing way. Now, that may sound huge and enormous, but a more grounded story for me was I read about statistics of people in food poverty, and it led me to volunteer at a food bank, and it was an amazing experience. I got to meet people, talk to people, even pray with people in that setting. And it was just wonderful to see their need met and to get food So they knew for that week that they would be able to feed their family. And lastly, commitment. We all have some sort of commitment. And this picture on the screen here, some of you might have seen it before or something similar. This is the Blob swimming pool. And this is used in team building to work out where you are in the team or organization or around a cause, and has been used in faith as well. Do you feel like you're at the point of just dipping your toe in? Are you feeling like you might walk away? Do you only want to go so far? Or do you want to jump in and receive everything that Jesus has for you? He has for us a connection. He's aching to be connected for us. He wants to give us a complaint to help build a new Jerusalem. And he wants to use our commitment in that. And I wanted to finish with what Nehemiah says in verse 18. And it shows his confidence and how God sees him and the work he was doing. Nehemiah said, "So they began the good work." Before they'd even started, God saw it as good. They hadn't done anything, and God saw that it was good. St. Andrews has this amazing vision and is ready to step into it, is stepping into it, and God sees it as good because it's nothing of what we do and everything about him. It was nothing of what Nehemiah was actually going to do, although it was good that Nehemiah made a plan and that God was using him in that way. But it was God doing the work. As we plan to rebuild church, know that God sees you as good. Earlier in the Old Testament, the character Gideon, this is one of my other favorite Bible characters. In the beginning of the book, he is scared and in a hole in the ground, basically. And God calls him to lead an army, and an angel comes to visit him and calls him a mighty warrior. Before he's done anything, he's still scared and like biting his nails in this hole in the ground. And God calls him a mighty warrior. As we go out into the world, God sees us as good. God sees the difference we want to make in the world and in the church as good. Would you stand with me? Let's just take a moment to pray. You may want to take a posture of receiving from God, not, for instance, with your hands out, not because it does anything magical, but because a physical action helps back up a spiritual reality. Lord, I pray that you would share your heart with us. As we plan to rebuild, show us the difference that you want to make in this world. Pray that we would maintain that connection with you, that you would give us a complaint, and that you would use our commitment to you, Lord. Lord, I pray that you would speak directly to us. whatever was of me and unhelpful, Lord, I pray that you would take that away from our minds and our spirits, Lord. We pray, come, Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit. Speak into our lives now. When I was praying in the week, around this sermon and this talk, I had an image of somebody in a sumo suit. I don't know if you've seen them. They are great fun. But when you're in one, it's really hard to move. It really impedes your movement. And I felt that God was saying this is a time for us to take off that sumo suit, take off the padding that we don't actually need. And this is a time to be ready for what he has for us. And also, as we were just waiting on the Spirit there, I think that in this room there was somebody getting a fresh vision of what God is calling them to do. So in a moment we're going to respond in a song, but if the prayer team could come up and get ready, if either of those words speak to you, do come up. And if this is a time when you have felt nervous about getting involved in rebuilding the church and getting involved in Jesus' mission to rebuild the New Jerusalem, then please do come and get prayer as well. And we're going to sing God, I Look to You now.